I never thought my best friend's family would become the center of the darkest story I've ever lived through, the kind of nightmare that twists itself into your mind and never lets you sleep the same again. But it all began so quietly that at first it didn't even feel like horror. It just felt like life unraveling in ways too strange to explain. And now when I look back, every small detail feels like a warning I should have taken more seriously. Every flicker of shadow in their house, sudden silence, every whispered word behind closed doors, it all fits together in a web spun by something evil. Something that wanted them and eventually took them, and left me scarred forever. My best friend's name was Daniel, and we'd been close since middle school, inseparable really, the kind of friends who knew each other's secrets, who laughed at the same dumb jokes, who had plans for college, for road trips, for a future that never came, and his family was almost like my second family. I'd spent countless weekends at their house, playing video games with Daniel in his basement, eating his mom's homemade pizza, joking around with his little sister who adored him, even helping his dad with small chores like mowing the lawn or fixing a leaky faucet. And there was always warmth in that house, until slowly, piece by piece, that warmth began to fade. It started the summer we turned 16, when Daniel's dad lost his job at the auto plant, and with it went a certain brightness in his eyes. He grew quieter, moodier, sometimes snapping at Daniel or his mom for no reason. But I thought that was just stress, nothing more, and maybe that's why I brushed it off when I first noticed the strange symbols carved into the wood of their basement door. Symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't in any alphabet I recognized, looping marks and jagged lines that seemed to glow faintly when the light hit them just right. And when I asked Daniel about it, he just shrugged, said his dad was messing around with some old stuff he'd found in his uncle's attic, books and trinkets and a box full of weird carvings. But his shrug didn't hide the nervous twitch in his smile, and I could tell even he didn't fully believe the explanation he was giving me. Over the weeks that followed, things only got stranger, like how his mom started leaving food out on the back porch at night, plates of bread and bowls of milk, as though feeding something that wasn't supposed to be seen. And when I asked her about it, she would just smile too wide and say, "We don't waste food here, dear." But her eyes would dart toward the trees at the edge of their yard like she was waiting for something to come out. Daniel told me he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night to hear voices downstairs, whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the house, voices that weren't his parents or his sister, voices that hissed his name, telling him things he refused to repeat to me. And it got so bad that he started sleeping with headphones in just to drown them out, though even music couldn't completely silence the scratching he heard at his window glass, like fingernails dragging across it in the dead of night. I wanted to believe all of this was in his head, just his imagination running wild from stress. But then I saw it for myself. One late evening when I stayed over, we were sitting in his room playing on his Xbox when the power suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. And in the reflection of the black TV screen I swear I saw someone standing behind us, tall and thin with hollow eyes. But when I looked around, the room was empty, and Daniel just looked at me pale as a ghost and said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" And that was the first time I realized whatever was happening in that house wasn't just in his head. It was real, terrifyingly real, and it wanted his family. After that night when I saw the reflection, nothing between us felt the same, because suddenly the unspoken truth was out in the open. We both knew there was something in that house, something neither of us could explain, and pretending it wasn't there only made its presence stronger, like ignoring a wound that only festers deeper under the skin. And Daniel started confiding in me more, telling me things that even I had trouble believing. Like how he'd catch his little sister standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. whispering to the shadows as if she were having a conversation, her head tilting as though listening to some reply. But when he tried to wake her, she would turn her head slowly, her eyes clouded over and blank, and she would whisper in a voice too deep to belong to a child, "Don't interrupt, it's rude," before walking away and returning to bed as though nothing happened. His mom grew thinner, her face hollowing out like she hadn't been eating, though he swore he saw her sneaking raw meat from the fridge in the middle of the night, chewing it in the dark kitchen while staring at the back door, waiting for something beyond the glass. And his dad, well, he became almost unrecognizable, his once practical demeanor dissolving into erratic mood swings, violent outbursts. And nights where Daniel swore he heard chanting coming from the basement, guttural sounds in that same strange language I'd seen carved into the door. I tried to help the only way a teenager could, staying over more often, making excuses to keep Daniel out of the house, even bringing him to my place for nights at a time. But his parents always insisted he come back, and the pull of that house was like gravity, it wouldn't let him escape. And each time I stepped inside, I felt it too, the heavy air that seemed to vibrate with whispers I couldn't quite hear. The way the lights flickered in patterns like Morse code, like something trying to communicate. One night, as we were walking back from the gas station with sodas and chips, Daniel told me about the book his dad had found in that attic box, an old leather-bound thing with yellowed pages full of drawings of creatures that didn't look human, diagrams of bodies, and instructions that read more like rituals than anything else, and Daniel admitted he'd peeked at it once when his dad left it on the kitchen table. The words weren't in English, but somehow his brain made sense of them, and he couldn't stop reading, couldn't look away, and it terrified him because it felt like the book was inside him, feeding him knowledge he didn't want. After that, he said, the voices in his head got louder, telling him his family had been chosen, that the house wasn't a house at all but a vessel, a gateway, and they were supposed to open it fully by offering themselves willingly, by binding themselves to the thing waiting on the other side. I thought it was just his imagination at first, some crazy spiral he was trapped in, but then came the night when his dad invited me to stay for dinner, and I almost wish I'd said no, because I will never forget the way they all sat around that table, silent, the clinking of forks the only sound, and in the center wasn't food at all but a blackened object I couldn't even identify, something charred and unrecognizable. And when I asked what it was, his dad smiled too wide and said, "It's what we've been asked to share." And his mom laughed like the sound of broken glass. I pushed my plate away, making some excuse, but they all stared at me with those blank, distant eyes, and Daniel kicked me under the table to keep me from saying more. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, he pulled me aside and told me the truth, that his family was no longer really his family, that something had entered them, burrowed inside and was using their bodies. But it wasn't finished yet, it needed more, it needed their full surrender, their final act, and it was pushing them closer and closer to doing it, and he was terrified because sometimes when he looked in the mirror he swore he saw his own reflection smile when he wasn't smiling, his lips moving when he wasn't speaking, and he didn't know how much longer he had before it claimed him too. I wanted to help, I really did, but I was just a kid, unarmed against whatever ancient thing had sunk its claws into that family, and all I could do was watch as night after night they drifted deeper into its grip, their house transforming from a home into a temple of whispers and shadows, until I started to wonder if I'd ever get my friend back, or if he was already gone. It was around this time that the line between dream and reality began to blur for me too, because whenever I stayed over at Daniel's, I'd wake in the middle of the night to find myself standing in places I didn't remember walking to, like once I woke up in their backyard barefoot, the grass cold and damp under my feet, and when I turned toward the house, every window was glowing faint red, pulsing like a heartbeat. And Daniel was standing in the upstairs window staring down at me, his eyes completely black, and then I blinked and I was back in his room, lying on the sleeping bag he'd set out for me, sweat pouring off my forehead, but the dirt on my feet told me I hadn't been dreaming, not entirely. The thing was pulling me in too, I realized, feeding off proximity, using my connection to Daniel like a rope to drag me into its orbit, and I knew then that I couldn't keep pretending this was just his family's problem. I was part of it whether I liked it or not. I started doing research, desperate for answers, combing through old library archives, online forums, even old newspaper articles, and what I found chilled me. There had been reports of this house long before Daniel's family ever lived there, stories of the land being cursed, of disappearances dating back to the 1920s, of families who had lived there briefly only to vanish without a trace. Neighbors whispering of strange lights and chanting in the night, and always the same conclusion, that the house demanded devotion, demanded a family to complete the wish, though no one ever said clearly what that wish was. When I told Daniel what I'd found, He looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered that the voices had already told him. The wish was for his family to give themselves completely, body and soul, as a gift to open the gate, and once the gate was opened, the thing on the other side would cross through, and then it wouldn't just be about his family anymore, it would spread, it would take anyone near. That night was the first time I seriously thought about calling the police or even a priest, but deep down I knew it wouldn't matter, because whatever was happening wasn't something ordinary authority could handle, and besides, the entity seemed to anticipate every move we made, twisting them back against us. Like the night I tried to convince Daniel to stay at my house for good, and we packed up his backpack with clothes. But as soon as we stepped off his front porch the air grew unbearably thick, like walking through water, our legs heavy, lungs burning, and the street seemed to stretch on endlessly until we realized no matter how far we walked we were still on his block, still facing that cursed house, like it had bent reality itself to keep us there. His parents began preparing openly for the end, speaking less like people and more like vessels reciting instructions, his mom scratching symbols into the walls with her fingernails until they bled, his dad digging a pit in the basement that smelled of sulfur, and his sister humming strange lullabies in languages no child should know, and Daniel was breaking down in front of me, shaking, whispering that he didn't want to die. That he didn't want to belong to it, and yet he couldn't resist when it called. He would go blank, like sleepwalking, and start carving those same symbols into his own skin, and when I tried to stop him, his hand jerked violently, his voice not his own, growling, "You are not allowed to interfere." I'll never forget the night it all came to a head, when the house went silent in a way that made silence feel deafening, and the air smelled of iron and decay, and the family gathered in the living room as if compelled, each of them holding hands, chanting words that rattled in my skull like broken glass. And Daniel looked at me with tears streaming down his face, mouthing, "Help me," even as his lips chanted with the rest. And I realized the evil's wish was nearly complete, and that if I didn't act, I would lose him forever, maybe even lose myself, because already I felt the pull, the seductive whisper promising me release, belonging, power, if only I surrendered too. I wanted to scream, to grab him and run, to smash through the windows if I had to, but my body wouldn't move, like invisible strings held me in place, and the more I struggled, the tighter they pulled, until I felt like a puppet dangling before the thing waiting just beyond the veil. The living room walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their chanting, the strange symbols carved into the wood glowing faintly like molten veins running through the house, and the pit his father had dug in the basement exhaled a stench so foul it burned the back of my throat even from upstairs, like something rotting far older than any corpse, something primordial that had waited centuries to be called forth, and I could feel it pressing against the thin barrier of our world, desperate to push through. And the more their voices rose, the thinner that barrier seemed, like paper stretched to the point of tearing. I tried to scream Daniel's name, but my voice came out strangled, as if swallowed by the heavy air, and then his little sister turned her head toward me without breaking the circle, her eyes pure white, her lips curled into an inhuman smile, and in that guttural voice I'd heard before she said, "He cannot be saved, none of them can, the wish must be fulfilled." Daniel's mother's hands trembled violently, blood dripping from her fingernails where she had dug into her palms, and his father's eyes rolled back as he shouted words I couldn't understand, and then the floor beneath their feet began to crack, a fissure opening that revealed not dirt but something blacker than night itself, a void that seemed alive, writhing, and out of it rose whispers that weren't words but pure hunger. The moment it happened, Daniel tore his gaze from the circle and looked at me, his face torn between defiance and surrender, and for a split second I saw him, the boy I'd grown up with, the best friend who had shared every laugh, every secret, and he mouthed again, "Help me!" But his body was locked, his voice stolen by the chant, and I felt the tears burn down my face because I realized I couldn't stop it. I was watching him slip away before my eyes. The fissure widened, and from its depths rose hands, skeletal yet fleshy, stretching unnaturally long, wrapping around each family member like tendrils, binding them, pulling them closer to the pit, and yet they didn't resist, they welcomed it, their faces serene, ecstatic even, as if surrendering to something they had long awaited, and Daniel's voice joined theirs in unison, chanting louder, his eyes flickering between himself and something else entirely, until the thing inside him won. I could feel the house groaning, wood splitting, the lights exploding overhead, and my body was hurled against the wall by an unseen force, pinned there as though to make me watch, to force me to witness their devotion, their offering, and I screamed until my throat tore, but it didn't matter, because in that moment they were no longer Daniel's family, they were vessels, sacrifices, fulfilling the ancient promise carved into those walls. And with one final, deafening chant the floor collapsed. Beneath them, the void swallowed them whole, and the house fell into silence so deep it felt like the world itself had died. I crumpled to the ground as the strings holding me broke, gasping, shaking, my ears ringing, and when I staggered to the spot where they had been, there was nothing left but the smell of sulfur and the faint glow of those fading symbols, and I fell to my knees, sobbing, begging Daniel to come back. But the house gave me no answer, only a silence that pressed like a weight against my chest. When I finally stumbled outside, the night was unnaturally still, the stars gone, the sky heavy, and as I looked back, the house stood perfectly intact, no cracks, no signs of collapse, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better, I knew what I had seen, and I knew the wish had been fulfilled. And though I survived that night, I never escaped it, because sometimes when I close my eyes I can still hear their chant, still smell that sulfur. And sometimes I see Daniel in my dreams, standing at the edge of my bed, eyes black as the void, whispering in that guttural voice, "You should have joined us." As disturbing as that encounter was, it wasn't the only horror I've seen. The next story will pull you into an entirely different nightmare. I never thought my best friend would be the person who would slowly unmake me, piece by piece, from the inside out. But I suppose no one really expects the kind of darkness that comes wrapped in a smile, in years of shared laughter, and in memories built on the fragile trust of adolescence. Because when I think back to the earliest days of our friendship, it feels almost obscene to stitch those warm images to the horror that would eventually follow. And yet they are part of the same fabric, the same story, and I can't tear them apart no matter how hard I try. Because he was my anchor in high school when everything else seemed unstable. He was the one who sat with me when my parents were fighting in the kitchen. He was the one who passed me notes in class with ridiculous doodles just to make me laugh. He was the one who told me secrets about his home life, his father's temper, his mother's silence, and I trusted him with mine. And for years it felt like the kind of friendship that movies try to romanticize, that closeness where two people know each other so deeply it almost feels like one shared consciousness. And maybe that was the first warning sign I should have paid attention to, that his need for me was never just friendship but something hungrier, something that would eventually bleed over into possession, though at the time I dismissed the strange flickers of unease as nothing more than teenage intensity. Because it was flattering in its own way to be the person someone else relied on so completely, the person who could make them laugh even when their world felt like it was collapsing. But little by little the dynamic shifted. In ways that felt subtle at first, like the way he hated when I spent too much time with other friends, or the way he would guilt me when I didn't text him back quickly enough, telling me things like "You're the only person who actually understands me, and if I don't have you then I have nothing." And at the time I thought it was just desperation, loneliness, the echoes of his broken home life spilling over into our friendship. But now I see it was something darker, something that twisted love into control, because soon it wasn't just irritation or sulking when I wasn't available, it was silence, cold and heavy, punishments in the form of being ignored until I apologized even when I hadn't done anything wrong, and I would cave every time because I hated the feeling of him shutting me out. Hated the thought that he might actually believe I was abandoning him the way his parents seemed to, so I always gave in. I always made myself smaller just to keep him stable, but stability was never really possible, not with someone who saw me less as a friend and more as property, and the signs of that ownership began to leak through in ways that made my stomach turn though I didn't want to admit it then, like how he once flipped through my phone when I left it on the table. And when I asked what he was doing he just smiled and said, "Just making sure you're not cheating on me with other best friends," like it was a joke. But it didn't feel like a joke, it felt like surveillance, like he was taking inventory of every conversation that wasn't with him. And then there was the time I skipped hanging out with him because I had a group project, and he showed up at the library anyway, sitting a few tables away with his hood pulled up, staring at me the whole time, and when I confronted him afterward he laughed it off, said he was just studying there too, but he didn't have any books, no notes, nothing. And I told myself I was imagining things, that he was just lonely. That he wanted to be around me because I was his only friend. But late at night when I replayed the moment in my head, it didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like a test, like he was watching to see if I noticed, if I would call him out, if I would acknowledge that he was always just a little closer than I wanted him to be. And the more I tried to rationalize his behavior, the more excuses I made, the more entangled I became. Because he knew exactly how to pull me back in, how to say the right words, how to confess his fears and insecurities in a way that made me feel guilty for even thinking of stepping away. And in that guilt I buried the unease, I buried the moments that should have warned me. Because he wasn't just my best friend, he was my history, my confidant, the person who knew my secrets. And the thought of losing that connection felt like losing myself. But I didn't realize then that he had already started taking pieces of me, slowly, carefully, wrapping his hands around the edges of my life until they were blurred, until I couldn't see where I ended and he began. And that was when the psychological games truly started, subtle at first, invisible almost, but they left me doubting myself, questioning my memories, wondering if maybe I was too sensitive, too paranoid, if maybe the problem wasn't him at all but me. Because he had this way of twisting conversations so that I felt like the aggressor, the betrayer, even when all I had done was try to set a boundary. And he would say things like, "I can't believe you'd think that of me, after everything we've been through," and suddenly I would feel like a terrible person, apologizing for hurting him, apologizing for needing even the smallest bit of space, and he always forgave me, with a smile that looked more like victory than reconciliation, and I told myself that was what friendship was, forgiveness, loyalty. The kind of loyalty that meant sacrificing parts of yourself for the person you care about. But I didn't understand that what he wanted wasn't loyalty, it was submission, and the more I gave, the more he took, until eventually I didn't recognize myself in the mirror anymore, and yet somehow, some part of me still believed this was what friendship was supposed to feel like. Still believed I was lucky to have someone who cared this much, even as the care began to curdle into something far more suffocating, something I wasn't sure I could escape, though at the time I didn't even realize I needed to escape. Because the trap had been set so carefully, disguised as love, disguised as devotion, and it would be years before I understood the depth of his manipulation, years before I could look back and see how every word, every silence, every calculated smile was another step toward breaking me in ways I still haven't fully recovered from. It was during senior year that things really started to unravel, though I didn't see it clearly at the time because when you're inside the storm it just feels like weather. It doesn't feel like the kind of devastation you'll only recognize later when you're picking through the wreckage. And for me that wreckage was the subtle way my best friend made sure I was always within reach, always accounted for, always tethered to him. Like the invisible string of a marionette, tugging at me whenever I tried to drift too far. And at first it was just small interruptions, like him calling me multiple times if I didn't answer the first, or showing up unexpectedly at my house under the guise of wanting to hang out. But soon it grew stranger. Like the time I was walking home from school with another friend and later that night he texted me details about what I was wearing, how I laughed too much at something stupid the other friend said, and when I asked how he knew, he just wrote back, "I notice everything about you," and followed it with a winking emoji, and I remember staring at the screen feeling a cold pit settle in my stomach, but I laughed it off when we saw each other the next day, pretending it was just a weird joke. Because the alternative, that he had been following me, watching me without my knowledge, was too unnerving to consider, and that became a pattern, me brushing aside the growing strangeness because I didn't know how to confront it, didn't know how to reconcile the boy who once stayed up with me all night when my dog died with the boy who now seemed to be keeping invisible tabs on my every move. And maybe that's the cruelty of psychological manipulation, how it entangles itself with the good memories, how it forces you to question whether you're overreacting, whether the person who once felt like family could really be capable of something sinister, and so I excused it, even when it became harder to ignore, like when he started hinting that he knew things he shouldn't, personal things I hadn't told anyone, like the argument my parents had one night when they thought I was asleep, and when I asked how he knew, he just smiled. Said you talk in your sleep sometimes, and the way he said it made my skin crawl because I couldn't remember ever sleeping near him, and yet he seemed so sure, so casual, and I wanted to push back, I wanted to demand answers, but instead I swallowed it down, telling myself maybe I had mentioned it in passing and forgotten, because it was easier to gaslight myself than to admit he might be worming his way deeper into parts of my life I hadn't invited him into. And as graduation loomed and everyone else talked about futures and colleges and escapes, he began talking more and more about how nothing would change between us, how I was the only constant in his life, how even if we ended up in different states we would always be connected, and while his words should have sounded reassuring, they felt more like shackles, more like a sentence than a promise, because deep down I knew he didn't want me to grow, didn't want me to leave, and every time I hinted at wanting to experience new things, to meet new people, he would withdraw into that punishing silence, making me feel as if my dreams were betrayals, and I hated myself for letting that work, for letting his disappointment steer me, for shrinking my own desires just to soothe him, but it became automatic, like a reflex, because the alternative was conflict, and conflict meant days of tension, guilt, and the subtle, needling remarks that reminded me how much I hurt him by not choosing him first. And soon I was exhausted, drained in ways I didn't even recognize until later, my thoughts looping constantly around how to keep him calm, how to keep him close without suffocating under the weight of his need. And then came the incident that finally shattered the illusion, though even then I tried to stitch it back together, desperate not to believe what was happening, because one night, late, when I was lying in bed scrolling on my phone, I heard the faintest sound outside my window, the scrape of something against the siding. And when I pulled back the curtain I saw him, standing there in the yard, staring up at me, his face lit faintly by the glow of the street lamp, and my whole body went rigid because it wasn't the casual look of someone who had dropped by to say hi. It was something else, something hungry, unblinking, and when our eyes met he didn't smile, didn't wave, he just stood there, watching, and then after a few endless seconds he turned and walked away into the shadows, leaving me trembling. My heart rattling so hard in my chest I thought it might break through my ribs. And I didn't sleep that night, didn't tell anyone the next day, because how could I? How could I explain that my best friend was outside my window in the middle of the night like some kind of phantom? And when I saw him at school he acted normal, joked about homework, asked what I'd had for breakfast, as if nothing had happened. And I started to wonder if maybe I had imagined it, maybe it had been a dream, but then. Later that day he leaned close when no one was around and whispered, "You should really close your curtains at night, you never know who might be watching." And then he laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. But there was no warmth in his eyes, only that cold glint I had seen in the yard. And that was the moment something inside me cracked, because suddenly I couldn't dismiss it anymore. Suddenly I couldn't keep gaslighting myself into believing this was normal friendship. And yet, even with the fear crawling under my skin, I stayed because he was my best friend, because cutting him off felt like cutting off a limb. Because he knew too much about me, and maybe, if I'm honest, because part of me feared what he might do if I really tried to leave, and so I continued, caught in this toxic orbit, each day a balancing act of appeasement and silent dread. Until slowly I realized I wasn't just scared of losing him. I was scared of him, and that shift in understanding was the most terrifying part of all, because once I saw it I couldn't unsee it, couldn't ignore the way his presence made the air feel heavy. The way his laughter echoed with something sharp beneath it, the way he seemed to delight in knowing he had me trapped, and though I told myself I would find a way out, deep down I wondered if it was already too late. If by the time I recognized the danger I had already surrendered too much of myself to ever truly escape. The weeks after that night at the window blurred together in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion because no matter how much I told myself I was imagining things, every shadow outside felt like him. Every knock at the door, every rustle of branches against glass made me flinch, and I started double-checking locks, shutting my blinds tight, even sleeping with the light on. But none of it helped because he had already crawled into my head. carved out a space in the part of my brain that should have been safe, and the cruelest part was how he still played the role of the perfect best friend when others were around, joking, helpful, always by my side, so that no one else saw what I was seeing. No one else noticed how his eyes lingered on me too long, how he brushed off my attempts to put distance between us as if they were nothing more than passing moods, and if I dared to pull away, even just a little, he would remind me of things I'd told him in confidence, secrets he could spill if he chose, and the implication was always clear: you don't leave me, because if you do, you lose everything, and maybe worse. And I felt trapped in a way that was hard to describe, because how could I explain to someone else that my best friend was suffocating me, watching me, controlling me, when on the surface it looked like we were inseparable, like we were the closest bond two people could have, and that was the genius of his manipulation. How he could make me look ungrateful or paranoid if I spoke up, and so I kept it to myself, burying it deeper, even as my grades slipped, even as I stopped sleeping, even as I avoided everyone else, because I knew he would notice if I tried to build other connections, and the isolation only made him stronger, gave him more control, until one night I finally broke, because I woke up not to a noise outside but to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open, and I froze in the dark, heart pounding so violently I could taste blood in the back of my throat, and when my eyes adjusted I saw him standing there, silhouetted by the faint glow of the hallway light, his hands still on the doorknob, his breath slow and steady like he had all the time in the world, and I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, trapped like a bird in a cage, and for a moment we just stared at each other, him calm, me trembling, until he finally whispered, "I just wanted to make sure you're safe." And then he shut the door quietly and left as if what he had done wasn't a violation, as if he hadn't crossed the final boundary. And I sat there shaking until dawn, realizing that whatever this was, it was no longer just obsession or manipulation, it was invasion, it was ownership. He had decided that I belonged to him, and my silence had given him permission to act on it. And the next day when I confronted him, because I had to, I couldn't keep pretending. I told him he couldn't come into my house like that he had gone too far, and for the first time he didn't apologize or laugh it off. He just looked at me with this hard, flat expression and said, "You don't get to tell me how far I can go." And the sheer audacity of it, the cold conviction in his voice, made my stomach twist, because I realized then he didn't think he was wrong, he didn't think there were any boundaries between us, and when I stammered something about telling my parents he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, and said, "Go ahead, see if they believe you, see if anyone believes you." And that was the dagger. Because I knew he was right. I knew he had cultivated this image of the perfect friend so thoroughly that if I accused him of sneaking into my house in the middle of the night, people would think I'd lost it, and the helplessness of that realization was worse than anything he'd done. Because it made me understand that he had trapped me in a prison no one else could see, and from that moment I began to unravel, paranoia eating me alive, jumping at every sound, scanning the halls at school, withdrawing from anyone who might notice because I didn't want to risk him punishing me again, and yet he seemed almost emboldened by my fear, touching my shoulder longer than necessary, calling me late at night just to breathe on the line, scribbling notes in my locker that said things like "You're mine and no one else can have you," and though I tore them up the words still burned in my mind, permanent scars I couldn't erase, and I started to wonder what he was capable of, how far he would go to prove his control. And that thought alone kept me awake more nights than I can count, until one evening when I finally reached my breaking point, because I was walking home alone after a late study session and I felt it. That prickling sensation of being followed, the weight of eyes on me, and when I turned, there he was, half a block back, not hiding, not pretending, just walking steadily after me, and my pulse spiked, my legs moved faster, but so did his, and soon I was practically running, fumbling with my keys as I reached my door, heart slamming against my ribs, and as I shoved myself inside I caught one last glimpse of him standing at the edge of the yard, not chasing anymore, just smiling faintly like he had proven a point. And that night I locked every door, every window, sat on my bed with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand, because I finally understood that he wasn't going to stop, He wasn't just my best friend gone wrong, he was something else now, something darker, and I was his fixation, his possession, and I didn't know how to escape without losing myself completely. I don't know if it was fear or desperation that finally pushed me into action, but after that night of sitting awake clutching a knife, I realized I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep letting him dictate the boundaries of my life, so I decided to try something reckless, something I thought might shock him into leaving me alone, and the plan was simple. I would cut him off cold, no explanations, no apologies, just silence. Block his number, avoid him at school, vanish from his orbit. And maybe he would get bored, maybe he would turn his fixation on someone else, and for the first couple of days it almost seemed like it might work, because even though I saw him in the halls and felt his eyes burning into me, I didn't answer his calls, didn't respond to his notes, didn't meet him after class the way I always had, and there was a fragile sense of control in that, a flicker of hope. But hope has a way of turning to ash when you're dealing with someone who refuses to let go, and on the fourth day, when I came home to an empty house, I knew before I even opened the door that something was wrong, the silence pressing against me like a weight, and when I stepped inside the living room I saw it, proof that he'd been there, that he could still reach me whenever he wanted. On the coffee table, perfectly centered, was a framed photo of me and him from years ago, one I thought I'd lost, one I hadn't even realized he still had. And across the glass and thick black marker he had scrawled mine in jagged letters, and the sight of it made my knees go weak, because it wasn't just possession, it was a declaration, a promise, and as I stood there trembling, trying to figure out what to do, I heard the faintest creak from upstairs, the kind of sound an old house makes when someone moves carefully across the floorboards, and my blood turned to ice. I knew I was supposed to be alone, my parents wouldn't be home for hours, and yet the sound was unmistakable, deliberate, and I wanted to run but my legs felt rooted to the floor, every instinct screaming at me to get out, but before I could decide the moment was over, because he appeared at the top of the stairs, calm, composed, like he had every right to be there, and for a long second we just stared at each other. Predator and prey, though I wasn't sure anymore which was which, and then he started down the steps slowly, each creak of the wood echoing in my ears like a countdown, and I finally snapped out of it, backing toward the door, my hands fumbling for the knob, but he spoke before I could escape, his voice low and steady, "Don't run, you'll only make it worse," and the certainty in his tone froze me more than any shout could have, because it wasn't a threat, it was a fact. Like he had already decided what was going to happen, and I whispered something. I don't even remember. What, maybe please or stop or why, and he just shook his head like I was a child who didn't understand. And then he was close enough that I could see the cold gleam in his eyes, the same one I'd seen that night in the yard, and he said, "You don't get it, do you? You're all I have, you're all I'll ever need, and you don't get to take that away from me." And then his hand shot out, gripping my wrist so tightly I thought the bones would snap. And panic finally jolted me into action. I twisted, shoved, screamed as loud as I could, the sound tearing from my throat raw and desperate. And somehow I wrenched free, stumbling back, slamming my shoulder into the door hard enough to rattle it, and in that instant I managed to unlock it and spill out onto the porch, my lungs burning, legs pumping, sprinting down the street without looking back, because I knew if I stopped, if I hesitated for even a second, he would catch me, drag me back inside. And no one would ever believe what had happened. And I don't know how long I ran. Only that when I finally stopped I was 3 blocks away, bent over and gasping, tears streaking down my face, and when I looked around everything looked the same, houses, cars, people going about their evenings, normal life still moving on while mine had just shattered, and I realized then that there was no safe place, not really, because if he could get into my house, if he could slip past every lock and boundary, then walls and doors meant nothing, and when I finally told my parents later, spilling out the whole truth in a panic torrent, they looked at me with disbelief, with pity, with confusion, and though they promised to talk to his parents, though they said they would handle it, I could see in their eyes that they didn't grasp the depth of it, didn't understand that this wasn't just teenage drama, this was something darker, and when the school counselor called me in the next day to ask questions in that careful, measured tone, I knew. Exactly how it would play out. Sympathy without action, advice without safety. Because no one wanted to believe that someone so charming, so helpful, so perfectly normal on the outside, could be capable of the things I described. And that was the final cruelty, the realization that even if I shouted the truth from the rooftops, the mask he wore would always protect him, and I would always be left looking like the broken one, the unstable one, and in that realization something inside me hardened, because I understood that no one was coming to save me, no authority or adult or parent could fix this. It was me against him, and if I wanted to survive I would have to find a way to outsmart him, to disappear, to cut every tie and rebuild myself somewhere he couldn't reach. And yet even as I thought it, even as I began to plan my escape in secret, I could feel his presence like a shadow stretching across my life. His voice echoing in my mind, "You're mine," and no matter how far I ran, no matter what I did, I knew he would always follow, because people talk about monsters as if they hide under the bed, but the real monsters wear familiar faces, call themselves your best friend, and smile at you in the daylight while planning how to own you in the dark. If you thought that was unsettling, wait until you hear the next story. I never believed in black magic, not really, not in the kind of way people whisper about it at sleepovers or share in half-serious ghost stories. But when my best friend Lily pulled the old wooden board from her closet one rainy Saturday, with its faded letters and strange symbols etched deep into the surface, something about it immediately unsettled me. Though she laughed off my hesitation with that playful grin of hers and said it would be fun, just a harmless game, and because she was my best friend, because I didn't want to look like a coward, I agreed, not knowing that decision would change everything. Not knowing that the night would leave scars either of us could explain. And it all started so simply, so childishly, just the two of us sprawled on her bedroom floor, the storm outside making the windows rattle while the candle we lit flickered shadows across the walls, and Lily, ever the adventurous one, placed her fingertips lightly on the planchette and urged me to do the same, giggling as she said in a mock-serious voice, "Spirits of the other world, come speak to us." And I rolled my eyes but followed her lead, pressing down on the cool wood, feeling slightly ridiculous. But then, almost immediately, the planchette twitched under our fingers, so subtly I thought Lily must be pushing it, and I shot her a look but she swore she wasn't, and before I could argue it slid smoothly to the letter H, then E, then L, spelling hello, and though we both laughed nervously, my laughter stuck in my throat because it didn't feel like her doing. Not entirely. And she must have felt it too because her grin faltered, and for a long moment we just stared at each other, the candlelight dancing in her wide eyes, and she whispered, "Did you?" And I shook my head quickly, muttering no, no way. But the planchette kept moving, spelling out "I see you," and a chill ran down my spine because the words felt directed at me, not us, and I wanted to stop right then. To shove the board back into its box and pretend it never happened, but Lily, ever braver than me, said we should keep going, said maybe it was just coincidence or some trick of our subconscious. And though everything in me screamed otherwise, I stayed, because that's what you do when you're 16 and afraid of losing face. Because she was my anchor and I didn't want her to think I was weak, so I kept my fingers on the board while the storm outside rumbled louder, and the air in her room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest like invisible hands, and the questions started. "Are you here? What do you want? Who are you?" The usual things you ask in these games. But the answers were not usual, not random nonsense like I expected. Instead the planchette moved with eerie confidence, spelling out names we didn't recognize, numbers that seemed like dates, and finally one chilling sentence. "The animal first," and Lily frowned, asking out loud what it meant, and before I could tell her not to, before I could even process the words, the candle flame sputtered violently and then went out, plunging us into darkness except for the flashes of lightning outside. And in that strobing glow I swear I saw something, a shadow, not cast by us, hunched in the corner of the room, watching, waiting. And then the dog barked, sharp and frantic, from downstairs. Lily's golden retriever Max, who never barked at storms, never barked at all unless there was someone at the door. And Lily called out to him, but her voice trembled, because she heard it too, that strange sharp edge to the barking, almost like he was warning us. And then came the sound of claws skittering on the hardwood, his paws racing toward us. But when Max finally burst into the room, fur bristling and teeth bared, he wasn't looking at us. He was staring into that corner where I thought I'd seen the shadow, growling low and guttural. The kind of sound I didn't think a dog like him could even make, and my skin prickled all over as I realized this wasn't just in our heads, this wasn't just some silly game, and I tried to get up, to grab Lily and leave, but the planchette was still under our fingers, still moving, and when I yanked my hand away in panic, Lily gasped, insisting we couldn't stop without saying goodbye, that you had to follow the rules or bad things happened. And though I wanted to scream at her that bad things were already happening, I froze, caught between my fear and her certainty. And that's when Max suddenly lunged at the corner, snapping his jaws at nothing, and for one horrifying second I thought I saw something recoil, something darker than the shadows peel away from the wall and retreat, and Max's barking grew more frenzied until Lily finally shoved the board away, yelling goodbye, goodbye, over and over, and just like that, the room seemed to exhale, the heaviness lifting slightly, though not completely. Because Max was still pacing, whining now, as if he'd lost sight of whatever had been there but could still smell it, and Lily and I just sat there in silence, the board shoved half under her bed, either of us wanting to touch it again, until finally she tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been the storm, that maybe we'd just scared ourselves, but her voice lacked conviction, and when I left that night, the storm having passed but the air still heavy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come through. That something had accepted her invitation, and though I wanted to forget it, wanted to chalk it up to teenage stupidity, the truth was waiting for us, and it wouldn't take long to show its teeth. I couldn't sleep that night, not even after I got home and shut my bedroom door tight, not even after I tried drowning out the memory with music in my headphones, because every time I closed my eyes I saw that corner in Lily's room, that place where the shadow seemed to crouch and wait, and I heard Max's growl echoing in my ears, low and raw like it came from his bones instead of his throat, and when I finally did drift off, it wasn't to rest but to dreams, sharp and cold, of being pinned to the floor by something I couldn't see while 100 whispered voices hissed my name, and when I woke, heart hammering, the clock glowed 3:07 a.m., the exact time we'd been playing with the board, and for a moment I thought I saw the faint outline of letters scratched into my ceiling, the same ones from the board, faint as chalk but there, and when I blinked, they were gone. The next day at school Lily tried to act normal, tried to joke about how we'd freaked ourselves out, how it was probably just us pushing the planchette without realizing, but her eyes betrayed her, bloodshot from lack of sleep, darting constantly like she expected something to lunge at her, and when I asked about Max she hesitated before saying he hadn't stopped barking at night, that he sat at the bottom of her stairs growling into the dark for hours, and her parents were annoyed but dismissed it as the storm making him skittish. We promised not to touch the board again, but even as she said it I could see she was lying, because there was a pull in her voice, the same one I felt deep inside me, like the game wasn't finished, like something was waiting for us to come back. And sure enough, 2 nights later she texted me at midnight, "It's happening again. Come over." Against every shred of reason I snuck out, the cool Michigan air biting at my face as I biked across the empty streets to her house, and when she let me in, pale in her pajamas, I heard Max whining upstairs, a broken, frightened sound I'd never heard from him before. "It won't stop," Lily whispered, pulling me into her room, and I saw the board was back on the floor, pulled fully from under the bed like it had been waiting, and my stomach turned cold because I remembered clearly shoving it under there myself. "You didn't touch it?" I asked. She shook her head, swearing she hadn't, that she'd even told her mom to throw it out, but when she went looking, it was right back where it had always been. We should have burned it then, smashed it, anything, but instead we sat down again, drawn like moths to flame, and placed our hands on the planchette because not doing it somehow felt worse, and instantly it started to move, faster than before, spelling with sharp confidence, "You came back." Lily's breath hitched, and I asked, "What do you want?" The answer chilled me more than the storm that had rattled her windows days before. Loyalty. Blood. The candle beside us guttered though the windows were shut tight, and then came the scratching, faint at first but growing louder, from inside her closet, like claws dragging across wood. Max howled downstairs, a high, mournful cry, and the planchette jerked under our fingers, moving so violently it nearly tipped off the board, spelling the same thing again and again. The animal first. Lily ripped her hands away, shouting, "Stop! Stop it!" But the planchette kept sliding across the letters on its own, faster now, rattling against the wood, and the candle went out all at once, drowning us in blackness. My chest seized as I heard the closet door creak open, so slow it sounded deliberate, and though I couldn't see, I knew something was there, something stepping out into the room with us. Lily fumbled for her phone flashlight, but before she could turn it on, Max barreled into the room, teeth bared, hurling himself straight at the closet, and the sound that followed made my blood turn to ice. A yelp, sharp and painful, cut short as though swallowed, and then silence. "Max!" Lily screamed, flicking on the light, and what we saw made us both reel back. Her closet door stood wide open, empty, and Max was gone. No dog, no sound of him running away, nothing. Just the faint smell of iron, thick and metallic, like blood. My stomach heaved and I staggered back against her bed, shouting his name, but there was no response, and Lily was sobbing, clawing at the closet floor, looking for any sign of him. But all she found was a single deep scratch gouged into the wood, far too high for Max to have made, as if something had dragged him upward, into the dark above. We should have run, should have told her parents, should have called the police, but we didn't. Because how do you explain something like that? How do you say your dog was pulled into another world by shadows because you were stupid enough to play a board game? Instead, Lily clutched at me, her hands shaking, whispering that it was her fault, that she shouldn't have brought the board out, and I didn't know how to comfort her because deep down I knew it was true, but worse, I knew the game wasn't over, because as I looked back at the board, lying untouched between us, the planchette slid once more across the letters, slow and deliberate, spelling out, "1 is gone. 2 to go." I don't remember how long we sat there after Max disappeared, maybe minutes, maybe hours, because time bent in Lily's room that night, stretching and collapsing until all that mattered was the weight of what had just happened, the way her sobs shook the walls, the way the silence after Max's yelp felt like the world holding its breath. I kept telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. He bolted, he squeezed through the closet somehow, maybe there was a hole in the back wall. But every time I looked at that deep, impossible scratch in the wood my stomach twisted because I knew he hadn't simply run away. Lily finally stopped crying long enough to whisper, "It's not going to stop, is it?" And when I tried to tell her it would, my voice cracked, betraying me. We agreed not to tell her parents. They wouldn't believe us, and the thought of them dismissing it as childish games made me sick. Instead, Lily shoved the board back under her bed and we sat side by side on her mattress until dawn broke, too afraid to sleep. The next morning she texted me during class, frantic. "It's back on the floor. I didn't touch it." I stared at the message until the words blurred, a heavy dread settling in my chest. By the time I got to her house that afternoon, her mom was in the kitchen, casually asking if I wanted snacks, oblivious to the fact that just upstairs her daughter's room was turning into a trap. When we went in, the board sat in the center of the carpet again, the planchette perfectly balanced as if someone had set it there with care. "We'll burn it," I said, and for a moment Lily's eyes lit up with hope. But when I picked the thing up my skin prickled and it felt heavier than it should, like it didn't want to leave. We took it outside, lit a match, dropped it into the dry leaves of her backyard fire pit. For a second the flame caught, licking the edges, but then the wind gusted hard, unnatural, blowing the fire out completely while the board sat there. Blackened but unburned. Lily stared at it like it was mocking us. "It won't let go," she whispered. That night I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing scratching in my own closet, faint at first, then sharper, until I threw the door open with a bat in my hand. Nothing. Just clothes swaying slightly on their hangers as though touched by a hand I couldn't see. I didn't tell Lily. I didn't want to add to her terror. But the next day she came to me pale as death, whispering that she'd heard Max barking from inside her walls. That broke something in both of us, because we knew then the spirit wasn't bound to the board anymore. It was bound to us. The worst came 3 nights later. We were on FaceTime, both too afraid to sleep, when I saw her eyes dart to the corner of her screen. "What?" I asked, but she just shook her head, forcing a smile, and then her phone froze for a split second, just long enough for me to see it too, a figure, tall and crooked, standing behind her in the shadows, gone the moment the video caught up. "Lily," I choked. "Don't move." She spun, saw nothing, but the terror in her eyes told me she felt it anyway. The board was back on her floor. The planchette spelled, "You are mine." After that, everything spiraled. Lights in both our houses flickered at the same time, electronics shorted, and in the quiet moments we both swore we heard breathing that wasn't ours. Lily's mom complained of headaches, her dad grew irritable and distant, but they never noticed the real horror closing in on their daughter. One night Lily called me, sobbing, saying she woke up to find her dog's collar sitting on her pillow, wet with something sticky she didn't dare check in the dark. She was convinced Max wasn't gone but trapped, used as some kind of sacrifice. I wanted to tell her it was impossible, but I couldn't, because deep down I felt the same dread clawing at me that the board had demanded. The animal first, and wasn't finished yet. We started researching, scrolling endless forums about Ouija boards and hauntings, but nothing helped because everyone said the same thing: never play, never say goodbye, never let it in. And we already had. That weekend Lily begged me to come stay over. I hesitated but gave in, telling my parents I was helping her with a project. That night, lying on her bedroom floor in a sleeping bag, I realized I could hear footsteps in the hall, soft and steady, back and forth all night, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty, her parents asleep. Around 3 a.m. I woke to Lily whispering my name, her face lit faintly by her phone screen. "It wants more," she said, voice trembling. "It told me, in my dreams. It said it won't stop until it gets both of us." I wanted to tell her it was just a nightmare, but the way her breath fogged in the warm room told me it wasn't. Then the closet door opened by itself. The closet door creaked open, slow and steady, and the air in Lily's room dropped so fast I could see my breath spill out in thin white clouds. We froze, clutching each other, and I swear I heard Max's whimper echo from the dark inside, faint and broken, like he was trapped somewhere we couldn't reach. Lily whispered his name, her voice shaking, and took a step forward, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I hissed, but the board on the floor rattled, sliding forward as though something inside the closet had pushed it toward us. The planchette moved instantly, sharp and angry. "Say yes." Lily and I stared at each other, and I realized what it meant. The entity wasn't asking anymore, it was demanding. "Yes to what?" I asked aloud, my voice cracking, and the planchette slammed across the letters so fast it nearly broke the board. "Your soul." Lily staggered back, shaking her head, whispering, "No, no, no." But then something slammed inside the closet, loud enough to rattle her posters off the wall, and Max's yelp tore through the room again, longer this time, more desperate. Lily's face crumpled. "It has him," she sobbed. "It has Max. If I say yes, maybe it'll let him go." I wanted to scream at her, to remind her he was already gone, but before I could, her phone lit up on the floor. A video began to play by itself. It was Max, in her backyard, tail wagging, alive, barking happily, but as we watched, his body twisted, folding unnaturally, his jaw unhinging as something crawled out of his throat. The screen went black. Lily dropped the phone with a scream. The board spelled again, "One soul freed. One soul left." My chest seized because I understood. The dog was never enough. We were the real payment. I tried to drag Lily out of the room, shouting that we had to leave, but the door slammed shut in our faces, and every drawer, every shelf, every object in her room began to shake violently, books spilling, glass shattering, the lamp exploding in a shower of sparks. Lily clutched the board, tears streaming down her face, and screamed, "Take me instead!" The planchette slid slowly to yes. I lunged for her, ripping the board from her hands, but it burned my skin, searing hot, and when I dropped it, it landed perfectly upright, not even tipping over. The closet yawned open wider, blacker than anything I've ever seen, and from it came a rush of cold wind that smelled of rot and earth, pulling at Lily's hair, her clothes, dragging her toward it. I grabbed her arm, digging my nails into her skin, but the force was stronger than me, tearing her from my grasp inch by inch. "Don't let go!" she screamed, eyes wide with terror. But my hands were slick with sweat, trembling, and in one awful moment she slipped. The darkness swallowed her whole. The door slammed shut. The room went still. I fell to the floor, sobbing, staring at the closet as silence crushed me, broken only by the faint sound of Max barking one last time before fading into nothing. When her parents burst in minutes later, I couldn't explain. Lily was gone, the board gone, everything neat and clean as if nothing had happened, except for the deep gouges clawed into the wood around the closet door, proof something had dragged her inside. They searched for her for weeks, plastered her photo across Michigan, but no trace was ever found. They blamed me at first, thought we'd run away or fought, but I knew the truth, and I could never tell them. To this day, I still hear her voice sometimes, late at night, whispering my name from my own closet, soft and desperate. And once, just once, I swear I saw Max's collar sitting at the foot of my bed, wet with something that smelled like rust. The game never ended. It never said goodbye.